I never thought I'd be the target of an HOA fight, but when Karen Thornton moved into my neighborhood in Asheville, North Carolina, things changed faster than I expected. I'm Ryan Mitchell, a 38-year-old software engineer who works remotely, and I've lived in my neighborhood for 7 years without any trouble. The neighborhood is quiet, the neighbors are nice, and the HOA, the Homeowners Association, is largely a name and name only. In the past, they'd send out reminders for minor issues like mowing the lawn or painting the fence, but no one had ever really given anyone a hard time. That changed when Karen moved in, however. Karen was a woman in her mid-40s with short blonde hair, always immaculately dressed in pastel sweaters and pressed slacks. From day one, she had established herself as someone who cared about order and discipline in the neighborhood. Less than a month after moving in, she had put herself on the HOA board, a move no one had ever made so quickly. Less than 2 months later, she began sending daily reminder emails, repeatedly citing HOA rules in a stern, unfriendly tone. Less than 3 months later, she had appointed herself Neighborhood Watch, walking around the neighborhood with her phone ready to record, looking for every little infraction to record and report. At first, it was thought to be just a zealous community policing enthusiast. But that enthusiasm quickly turned into a full-blown surveillance campaign. Anyone who walked through the neighborhood could see Karen on her morning rounds, her eyes darting around looking for what she considered violations. If she wasn't doing her own inspections, she was reviewing the security camera footage of other residents who shared her passion for control. Things got worse when HOA violation notices started coming in with frequency. One day I received a letter from the HOA warning me that my hedge was 2 inches taller than the code. Interestingly, the letter included a photo taken by Karen herself, using a measuring tape to prove my violation. Soon after, a neighbor received a citation for leaving a trash can outside after 8 p.m. Karen had taken the photo at exactly 8:01. Another family was cited for hanging a flag that was not the correct size according to HOA regulations. Even a retired couple was cited for leaving their daughter's car in the driveway overnight, citing it as an unauthorized vehicle. Karen didn't stop at reporting violations. She sent regular emails to the AOA with a list of what she thought needed to be fixed. The emails were filled with quotes from HOA rules, detailing details like how to arrange the patio chairs, the color of the mailbox, or even how to maintain the lawn. Many residents began to feel like they were living under a strict surveillance regime, where any mistake could be noted and punished immediately. It became clear to everyone that Karen had no intention of stopping. Those who tried to talk to her about loosening her grip were met with the cold reply, "You agreed to these rules when you bought your home." She dismissed any objections as meaningless and continued to exert her power over the neighborhood without caring who felt inconvenienced or unfair. To many residents, Karen was just an annoying but forgiving person. They thought that if they simply complied with her unreasonable demands, life would return to normal. But I wasn't so lucky. Because before long, Karen wasn't just taking note of my violations, she was trying to kick me out of the neighborhood. Despite Karen Thornton's relentless attempts to control the neighborhood, I still try to maintain a normal rhythm of life. One of the traditions I've kept for the past 7 years is the annual fall party, an event I host to get together with friends, colleagues, and neighbors in a relaxed atmosphere, but without anything too loud or out of control. I always give my neighbors a friendly heads up, saying there will be some extra parking on the street and maybe some music, but that everything will be over by 11 p.m. In previous years, no one has complained. But this year, I know Karen won't let it go. This year's party was a little more special because I invited Ethan Carter, an old college friend who had just been appointed the town's police chief. We had kept in touch over the years, and when he heard I was hosting the party, he happily agreed to come with his wife. I also invited familiar neighbors, including the Johnsons who lived next door to me and the Patels across the street. Although I knew Karen wouldn't attend, I sent the invitation out of courtesy, hoping it would appease her. The weather was perfect for an outdoor gathering. I had decorated the backyard with soft white lights, a small bar in the corner of the living room, and a catering company providing snacks. The music was kept low, enough to create atmosphere but not too loud. By 8 p.m., about 35 guests had arrived, spread out throughout the backyard and inside the house, chatting freely. It was all planned for an elegant evening, nothing too extravagant. Until 8:15, when the doorbell rang. I opened the door and, as I expected, there stood Karen Thornton, still in her signature cardigan, dressed not like a partygoer but like a supervisor on duty. She raised her phone and turned it toward me, announcing that my party had exceeded the city's noise level. And before I could react, she added that she had called the police. The atmosphere in the house fell for a moment. A few guests turned to look, surprised by the scene. In the distance, I saw Ethan step away from his group of friends and slowly approach to see what was going on. When he appeared beside me, Karen looked a little confused, but kept her tone firm. Ethan looked around, his eyes scanning the crowd, who were chatting normally, the speakers playing soft music, no signs of a party getting out of control. He remained polite, but I saw the amusement in his eyes as he realized this was all a farce. What Karen didn't know, or maybe hadn't checked, was that the city's noise ordinance allowed a maximum of 65 decibels after 10 p.m. on weekends, not 8 p.m., as she claimed. And from what was going on around me, my party was nowhere near that level. But Karen wouldn't accept her mistake. She repeated her old argument that the HOA had its own rules and any noise that disturbed the neighbors was considered a violation. I glanced across the living room, where the Johnsons and Patels, my closest neighbors, were looking on with expressions that were half amused, half bored. They were the ones most likely to be affected by the party, and they clearly had no problem with it. I asked Karen to come inside and join everyone, trying to keep her cool, but she coldly refused, insisting that I wasn't going to get away with this easily. Then I turned and walked away, my phone still recording. The party continued without further interruption, but Ethan decided to stay outside to check the noise levels, using a decibel meter app on his phone. By 10:30, he reported that the highest recorded level was only 58 dB, still below the legal limit. I thought that after this, Karen would give up. But I was wrong. Because just 3 days later, I received an official letter from the HOA, and the contents inside revealed that Karen had much bigger plans. 3 days after the party, I opened my mailbox and found an official letter from the HOA. Just by looking at the envelope, I knew Karen wasn't going to give up. I opened it and saw in bold print that I had violated multiple HOA rules, including causing a public nuisance, creating a traffic jam due to the number of cars parked on the street, and serving alcohol without a permit. It was accompanied by a $200 fine and a warning that if I continued to violate the rules, I could be considered for eviction under the disturbing resident provision of the community's bylaws. I was stunned. Not only was my party completely legal, but Karen had gone beyond filing a police complaint and had manipulated the HOA to make these baseless accusations official. I looked down at the signature section, where 5 HOA board members had signed, with Karen's name at the top of the list, along with the notation Community Compliance Officer. I immediately called Greg Thompson, the HOA president, to ask about the letter. Greg was awkward, unsure of his words, but when I asked specifically who had complained about the party, he couldn't name anyone other than Karen. He brought up a video that Karen had presented at the meeting, in which she pointed out cars parked on the street and claimed that they were blocking the emergency exit. But the problem was that all the cars were parked properly, and no one was breaking any traffic laws. I immediately realized this was a deliberate ploy. Karen couldn't use the police to force me, so she turned to the HOA as a tool of pressure. But Karen wasn't the only one with access to evidence. I contacted Ethan Carter, and we met that evening to go over everything. I showed him the letter from the HOA, and after reading it, Ethan shook his head in disgust. He had been at the party, had seen it all, and what's more, he had measured the noise levels himself, which showed that they were well below city limits. Ethan opened his phone and pulled up a series of records from the decibel meter app that night. The highest reading he had recorded was just 58 dB, significantly lower than the 65 dB limit set by the city ordinance for nighttime noise. This meant that the police had no reason to prosecute me, as I had not violated any noise ordinances. My case was further strengthened when Ethan showed me the official police report, which did not list any violations related to the party. We decided to use the facts to turn the tables. Ethan called the police station, requested a copy of the incident report, and confirmed that the noise complaint was unfounded. This not only disproved Karen's claim, but also showed that she had gamed the system to cause trouble. Ethan also went into detail about the city's noise ordinance to show that Karen was completely wrong in her complaint. The ordinance clearly states that the maximum sound level after 10 p.m. on weekends is 65 dB, not 8 p.m., as she claimed. Not only that, the HOA provision she cited regarding noise-disturbing neighbors is also inapplicable in this case, since no neighbors other than Karen complained. I felt like it was starting to become clear that Karen was not only wrong, but that she was deliberately manipulating the process to put pressure on me. But the bigger question was, why did the OAA let this happen? Why did they accept Karen's baseless claims without examining any of the evidence? That showed me a bigger problem. Karen was not just a nuisance resident. She was slowly turning the EHU her own personal tool to control the entire neighborhood. And if I did nothing, I wouldn't be the only one she targeted. Looking back at the HOA letter on my desk, I knew I couldn't let this go without a fight. I needed to speak up, present the evidence, and force the HOA to face the truth. Ethan offered to come with me to the next HOA meeting, and this time we would not only defend myself but show the whole neighborhood who was manipulating them. I knew Karen wouldn't give up easily, but I didn't expect her to escalate this quickly. After her noise complaint failed and was dismissed by the police, she switched to another tactic, using the OA as a tool to continue pressuring me, this time with more serious charges. Less than a week after the party, I found another letter from the HOA in my mailbox, this one with a much stronger tone. The letter opened with 3 major violations, all of which were completely unfounded. First, they claimed I was causing a public nuisance, even though Chief Ethan had confirmed that there had been no violations that night. Second, I was charged with creating a traffic jam, claiming that the cars parked on the side of the road were blocking the emergency exit. But I clearly remember that everyone was parked properly, and no cars were blocking the road or the exit. I even checked the next morning, and there were no signs or regulations prohibiting parking in those spots. And finally, the OA accused me of serving alcohol without a license, a completely ridiculous charge since this was a private party at my house, not a commercial event or illegal bar. I read the letter with shock and anger, not only because the accusations were absurd, but because it was clear that Karen was trying to push the issue even further, using the power she held within the HOA to intimidate me. The letter ended with a warning that if I continued to violate the law, the HOA would consider more severe measures, alluding to the possibility of initiating eviction proceedings against me. This time, I didn't call Greg Thompson, the HOA president. It was clear to me that he wasn't really in control of the situation, or worse, that he was trying to ignore it to avoid conflict with Karen. Instead, I started gathering evidence. I went to each of my neighbors who had attended the party and asked them if they had received warning letters from the HOA. None of them had received any notice, and I was the only one targeted. This showed that Karen didn't really care about the order or safety of the neighborhood. She just wanted to make me a target. I also went back to check my security camera footage from that night. The images clearly showed that the vehicles were parked properly, with no obstruction to the emergency exit. If necessary, I could bring this evidence to refute the HOA's charges. But what bothered me most was the way Karen used the HOA as a personal weapon, not to protect the neighborhood but to exact revenge. Ethan did not sit idly by either. He filed an official report with the HOA, confirming that there were no violations related to noise or public order that night. This meant that one of the 3 charges was completely dismissed, leaving only 2 charges related to parking and serving alcohol, both of which had no legal basis. I knew that if I didn't act now, Karen would continue to escalate. She wasn't just going to find me, she was going to try to get me kicked out of the neighborhood. That meant I couldn't just wait and react each time she attacked. I needed to bring this up at the HOA meeting, not only to protect myself, but also to raise questions about how the HOA was operating under Karen's influence. I spent the next few days preparing a plan, gathering all the evidence I could, including copies of police reports, security camera footage, photos of the parking lot, and testimony from neighbors who confirmed that the party had not caused any problems for them. As the HOA meeting approached, I knew that this would be more than just a simple confrontation. It would be the first time Karen would face the consequences of her own actions. I knew that the upcoming HOA meeting would be my best chance to refute the ridiculous accusations Karen had made. But defending myself alone would not be enough to counter her manipulation. I needed the big picture, clear evidence that Karen had not only targeted me, but that she had made the entire neighborhood her target. So over the next few days, I began to reach out to neighbors to find out if I was the only one suffering from this abuse of power. It didn't take long for me to find out the truth. When I arrived at the home of Bob and Linda Johnson, the couple who lived next door to me, they had even prepared documents to share. They pulled out a thick stack of paper, which contained 3 violation notices they had received in the past 2 months. One was for leaving a trash can outside for more than 12 minutes past the designated time, which Karen had photographed at exactly 8:01 p.m., just 1 minute past the HOA deadline. Another was for a delivery car that stayed outside for more than 10 minutes, even though it was just a grocery delivery and left shortly after. Similar stories emerged throughout the neighborhood. When I asked the Paddles who lived directly across the street from me, they said they had been fined for planting a tree that wasn't on the HOA's approved list, even though they had had the tree for years. Another family was warned because their kids were playing basketball in the street, something they had never complained about before. An elderly neighbor said Karen had photographed every corner of his yard, then sent him a letter warning him that the grass needed to be cut an inch shorter. I realized that Karen didn't just have a problem with me. She was waging a full-scale campaign of control, using the HOA bylaws as a tool to exert personal control over the neighborhood. But what really shocked me was when I got the numbers. One of my neighbors, who had been on the HOA board before, told me that the entire previous year, the total number of citations for violations in the entire neighborhood had been only about 10 to 12. But in the 2 months since Karen became the community compliance officer, the number of citations had exceeded 30, 3 times the total for the entire year before. Not only did this mean that Karen was intentionally abusing her power, but it also showed a pattern of intentional behavior. She wasn't simply enforcing the rules. She was using them as a way to gain control. I dug deeper and found that most of the violations she documented were based on extremely minor details, things that no one in the HOA had ever considered a serious issue before. As I continued to gather evidence, another trend became clear. Karen was targeting specific residents, especially those who weren't involved in HOA activities or had previously opposed her. Families with young children, seniors who couldn't easily handle the HOA's constant requests, and people who didn't have time to deal with the hassles of paperwork were all targeted. The HOA meeting was on a Thursday night at the neighborhood community center. I arrived early, armed with a file full of the ridiculous warning letters Karen had sent to me and my neighbors, testimonies from other residents, and statistics showing that Karen had issued 3 times as many violations in the past 2 months as she had in the entire previous year. But the most important thing I brought was Ethan Carter. As the police chief, he was not only an objective witness, but he had the authority to call out Karen's serious misconduct. When it came to the HOA rule violations, Karen quickly stood up and presented a list of charges against me, showing the photos she had taken at the party, along with video of the police showing up at my house that evening. Her voice was firm, emphasizing that I was a repeat offender and that the HOA needed to take strong action to protect the community. What she didn't know was that I was more prepared than ever. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice calm, starting by explaining each accusation clearly, then presenting evidence to counter it. I presented the police report, which confirmed that there had been no noise or disturbance violations at my party. I projected security camera footage, which showed that the vehicles were properly parked, none of them blocking the emergency exits as Karen had alleged. I went on to present ticket statistics, showing that Karen had unilaterally issued more than 30 warnings in 2 months, 3 times the total for the entire previous year. Ethan explained that the misuse of emergency calls was not only a waste of police resources, but could also be considered abuse of the emergency system, which could be investigated if continued. Wifey. Noel. Several residents in the meeting room began to murmur, clearly unaware that Karen had repeatedly called the police on non-existent issues. Ethan continued to emphasize that the police could not be a personal tool to resolve personal conflicts or HOA disputes, and that if this continued, then Karen could face more serious legal consequences. I looked at Karen and saw that her expression had changed. Her initial cool confidence had been replaced by a palpable tension. But instead of admitting her mistake, she tried to argue back, repeating the same old arguments about protecting the public and that she was just doing her job. However, there was no one in the room on her side now. Greg Thompson, the HOA president, coughed to get my attention, then looked over the documents I presented, his eyes wavering, but as if realizing he had let Karen run amok for too long. Janet Reynolds suggested reviewing Karen's recent violations and tightening up enforcement. Karen sat there, but no one was listening. Her control had collapsed, but I knew there was one last step to end this mess. The HOA meeting lasted longer than expected, but the results were clear. Karen Thornton was not only enforcing the rules, she was also abusing her power to control and intimidate residents. When I presented the evidence and Ethan Carter confirmed that Karen had called the police 14 times without cause, the HOA's patience was exhausted. Even those who had supported her could not deny the truth. Greg Thompson, the HOA president, finally admitted reality. After a moment of silence, he read over the documents I had provided and announced that the charges against me would be dropped immediately. There was no evidence that I had violated any HOA rules or city ordinances, and all warning letters I had received would be expunged from my record. This also meant that the $200 fine the HOA had sent me would be refunded, along with an official notice from management confirming that I was no longer considered a troublesome resident as Karen had tried to label me. But more importantly, the meeting was not just about getting my charges dismissed. After seeing the extent to which Karen had manipulated the system, many residents in the room began to speak up about how unfairly the HOA was enforcing its rules. They shared their own experiences with unnecessary warning letters, with photos being taken secretly, and how Karen had turned the HOA into her own tool to pressure residents. Janet Reynolds, a longtime HOA member, proposed that the entire HOA be re-examined, especially how it handles community violations. A quick vote was held, and within minutes, a momentous decision was made. All citations issued by Karen over the past 2 months would be suspended immediately. Residents who had received citations from Karen would have the opportunity to appeal, and if there was no valid evidence, the citations would be dropped altogether. This change was not simply a corrective measure, but an admission that the OA had been manipulated and that it needed to be fair to the residents. No one objected to the decision, and even Greg, who had been reluctant to confront Karen, agreed that the HOA needed to rebalance to ensure that the bylaws were not being used to cause problems for residents. Karen remained silent for the remainder of the meeting, but she was no longer in control. No one defended her. No one made excuses for her actions. As the meeting came to a close, I looked around the room and saw the relief on the faces of many neighbors that the neighborhood was finally free of Karen's grip. I didn't need any more arguing or convincing. The facts spoke for themselves. Not only did the HOA drop the charges against me, they decided to change the way they operated, to ensure that the community would never again be controlled by an authoritarian individual. This was not just a victory for me, but a huge step forward for the entire neighborhood. But even though the matter was largely settled, I knew that this was not the end for Karen Thornton. She might no longer have power, but that didn't mean she would give up easily. And I was right, because just a few days later, Karen made her final move, and it was one that no one in the neighborhood saw coming. Less than 24 hours after the HOA meeting, an email was sent to the entire neighborhood. Karen Thornton officially resigned from the HOA board, effective immediately. There was no explanation other than a brief statement that she no longer felt aligned with the direction of the community. I wasn't surprised. After being exposed in front of the entire neighborhood, Karen understood that she could no longer manipulate the HOA. She lost her tools of power, she lost the support of the remaining members, and most importantly, she lost control of the community. But even though Karen was gone, her legacy was a positive one. In the aftermath, the HOA began to reform its policies, shifting its focus from rigid policing to building a more cohesive community. Board members decided to eliminate overly strict rules and to change the way violations were handled to a warning before being punished, rather than the immediate, harsh penalties Karen had imposed. A new 3-step process was introduced, first a friendly reminder, then a formal warning, and only if the violation continued would a penalty be imposed. The changes were well received, and the number of HOA warnings dropped by 80% in just 3 months. Not only did the policies change, but so did the spirit of the neighborhood. Without the worry of surveillance and unreasonable warnings, residents began to relax and open up to each other. People who had been quiet for fear of being targeted began to participate more in community activities. Families spent more time outside, children played basketball in the street, without fear of being photographed and reported, and sidewalk coffee nights among neighbors became the norm. I felt the difference myself, no longer looking over my shoulder when I walked out the door, no longer worrying about unreasonable warning emails popping up in my inbox. And as a way to mark the new beginning of the neighborhood, Ethan Carter and I threw a huge community party with the HOA and all the residents. No more worries about complaints or traffic. Everyone enjoyed the fun under the lights, music and laughter. Ethan jokingly held up his phone to measure the decibel level, laughing when it was still below the legal limit. In that moment, I realized that this neighborhood had finally become a real community, a place where rules existed to maintain harmony, not to control people. A place where residents looked out for each other, not to report each other. A place where people could live comfortably, without fear of being judged for small mistakes. A new family moved into Karen's house not long after. As soon as they moved in, I went over to greet them, carrying a bottle of wine as a welcome gift. They seemed a little surprised, but smiled when they saw me being friendly. As I walked home, I saw the neighborhood kids playing basketball down the street, throwing the ball into my court. I picked it up, threw it back to them, and laughed. No yardstick, no mugshot, no warning letter. Just a neighborhood that was truly a community. Have you ever encountered an overbearing HOA? Have you ever had an annoying neighbor try to control your life? If so, how did you deal with it? Share your story, because it might help someone else in a similar situation. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss out on the next exciting story. See you in the next video.